So we've seen the power of group by in an SQL statement, but such a simple group by select statement, I don't want to write it on my own. I want it to be written for me. And we all know that the less code we write, or the less statements that we write, the less chance we have of making mistakes. And I would prefer the code to write this group by statement for me and adjust our controller to do that. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's just put this here on the side as a split screen for some kind of inspiration. Okay, and let's start adjusting our code to do that. So there's a cool helper class called SQL group by. So let's just use it. I'm going to call it GB and say new env data SQL group by, and it receives in the constructor an entity. So I'm going to give it the order details. Perfect. Now instead of running on order details, I'd like to run on the group by entity. So I'm going to say gb.entity. Okay, the entity that is generated for the group by. Now instead of adding joins to our controller, I want to add them to our group by statement. So I'm going to say gb.add join two orders, and of course I don't need a relation type, it's implied. So I can add that, and I can do the same over here. So I'm going to add a join to customers, and again I don't need the relation type. So by doing these two lines, I've basically written these two lines in our SQL statement. Great. Now I want to write the group by product ID. So I'm going to say gb.add column from order details product ID. Okay, so this adds this part of the statement. Great. Next I want to add sum to quantity. So let's do that. I'm going to add a local column, number column, sum quantity, and I'm going to add another column called sum amount. Perfect, so I have these two local columns, and I'll say here, group by, add sum. The result column should be sum quantity, and the value column is going to be order details dot quantity. So this line of code will generate this line of code in the SQL statement. Now this one is a bit more complicated, it's just a basic column, but there's a solution for that as well. So I'm going to say gb add aggregate column. The result column is going to be sum amount, and the operation is going to be sum of one field times another field, and the first field is going to be order details dot quantity and order details dot amount dot unit price, sorry. Perfect. So I'm going to have a sum of quantity times amount. Great. Let's look at what else do we have in our controller that we need to adjust. The relations, the insert if not found relations should stay because we still want to insert to the memory table. The filters should go to the group by entity. I want them to be part of the original query. So I'm going to say gb dot and gb dot, okay, which means the group by where should have this and the group by where should have this. Next, order by, I don't need it. Columns. Let's take away all the columns. We need to take away all the columns that aren't in our query. So we pretty much need just the product ID, the sum of quantity and sum of amount. So let's take everything else off. Customers doesn't appear here anymore, so we'll take it away. Orders doesn't appear here anymore. Order ID is still here. Unit price and quantity, again, don't appear here anymore because they are part of the aggregate column, so we don't need them. But we do still need all the columns from the product sales info because that's where we're adding our data. And we also need the two local columns that we've defined of sum quantity and sum amount. So we're going to say columns, add sum quantity and sum amount. Perfect. And last but not least, instead of adding the order details quantity, which we don't have anymore, we'll add the sum quantity and sum amount. Perfect. So by using this group by class, the group by entities that we have over here, or SQL group by class, we are able to generate the group by statement by still using standard coding without worrying about the subtleties of the SQL statement itself. Now let's run it and see that it works, first of all. Yes, we've got our data and we've got it pretty fast. Let's run it again with the profiler. And we can see here we want to follow the collect data. We can see that the collect data was reduced to 18 milliseconds. And it generated a dynamic SQL statement that looks very much like our previous group by statement, where we have our select, our group by, and our from with the inner joins. Perfect. And let's compare this to the original profilers that we had. So we can see here that the collect data, of course, runs a lot less than before. It used to run 820 milliseconds, now it just runs for 18 milliseconds, which is like 40 times faster. And we can see that the only rows that used to happen 2,156 times only happen here 77 times. So this represents a dramatic improvement in performance. And if you go again to the 250,000 rows that I've talked about earlier, this took it down from the 1 minute original or the 15 seconds after the joins. It took it down to less than a second for the full 250,000 rows. So using this SQL group by class is a very powerful tool. Let's review the changes that we've made. So let's open the changes and hide the SQL statement over here. So we can see here that we've added two local columns, some quantity and some amount. We've added the group by entity and replaced the from to be based on that instead of being the order details. We have moved the relations from the controller to the group by entity. And we've added the columns that we want to have, the sum of quantity that will go to the local column that we've defined over here, and the aggregate of amount, which is order details time quantity, sorry, quantity times unit price, that went up to some amount. We left the insert if not found relations to our small table, and we replaced the where, again moved it into the group by column and removed all the columns that we are not really using or needing over here, but added the two local columns and eventually changed the plus equals to be this. Now of course this is a bit more complex, but the performance benefit is amazing and it's kind of hard to ignore. I hope you enjoy it.